Haunted hospitals are a common setting for horror stories, and for good reason. These buildings are often filled with dark history and untold horrors, and the spirits of their former occupants linger on long after they have passed on. The three stories showcase the different ways in which the supernatural can manifest in a hospital setting, from vengeful spirits seeking revenge, to lost souls searching for peace, to the echoes of dark experiments that have left their mark on the building itself. Whether you believe in the paranormal or not, these stories are sure to leave you feeling uneasy and looking over your shoulder the next time you find yourself in a hospital after dark. Story 1: The Abandoned Wing. The old hospital had been abandoned for years, left to crumble and decay in the heart of the city. But even in its dilapidated state, the building held a dark and haunting history that drew thrill-seekers and ghost hunters from across the region. For years, rumors had circulated about the abandoned wing of the hospital, a section of the building that had been closed off for decades, left to rot and decay in the shadows. Legend had it that the abandoned wing was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of patients who had died there in agony and despair. People spoke of strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and unexplained phenomena that had been witnessed by those brave enough to venture inside. And so it was that a group of curious teenagers found themselves creeping through the darkened hallways of the abandoned wing one night, armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure. They had heard the stories, of course, but they didn't believe in ghosts. They were just looking for a good scare, something to tell their friends about back at school. But as they wandered deeper into the darkness, the teenagers began to feel a sense of unease. The air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their own footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. It was then that they heard the whispers, faint at first, but growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. As they turned a corner, the teenagers saw something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the dim light of their flashlights, they could make out the shapes of dozens of ghostly figures, patients in hospital gowns, their eyes empty and lifeless. The teenagers froze, paralyzed with fear as the ghostly figures began to move towards them. They could feel the icy grip of fear tightening around their hearts, as they realized too late the danger they had put themselves in. They turned and ran, but the ghost pursued them relentlessly, their moans and whispers growing louder with each passing moment. The teenagers never made it out of the abandoned wing alive, their bodies discovered the next day by a group of horrified passers-by. To this day, the abandoned wing of the old hospital remains sealed off, a grim reminder of the darkness that lies within. Story 2: The Ghost of Dr. Peters. Dr. Peters had been the head of the hospital's psychiatric wing for over 20 years, renowned for his groundbreaking work in the field of mental health. But as he grew older, Dr. Peters became increasingly isolated, his mind consumed by the ghosts of his past. He would spend hours locked away in his office, poring over case files and staring blankly at the walls. One day, Dr. Peters vanished without a trace. No one knew what had happened to him, and his disappearance remained a mystery for years. But then strange things began to happen at the hospital. Patients in the psychiatric ward would report hearing the sound of footsteps outside their rooms at night, and some claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of an elderly man moving through the halls. It wasn't until years later that a group of construction workers discovered a hidden chamber behind a wall in the hospital's basement. Inside, they found the remains of Dr. Peters, his body mummified by time and decay. But even in death, Dr. Peters refused to rest. His ghost haunted the halls of the hospital, stalking the living and tormenting them with his presence. Staff members reported hearing strange whispers and seeing the ghostly figure of the long-dead doctor moving through the halls. Patients in the psychiatric ward would wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing at the ghost of Dr. Peters became a source of fear and dread for anyone who worked or stayed in the hospital. But one nurse, Sarah, refused to be intimidated by the ghostly presence. Sarah had always been fascinated by the paranormal, and she saw Dr. Peters as a challenge, a puzzle to be solved. She spent countless hours studying the hospital's history, piecing together the fragments of Dr. Peters' life in an attempt to understand his motivations. As she delved deeper into his past, Sarah began to sense that there was more to Dr. Peters' story than anyone realized. She uncovered evidence of a tragic past, a family torn apart by mental illness and a life that had been consumed by guilt and regret. And then one night, as Sarah was working the night shift, she felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that Dr. Peters was near. But instead of feeling fear, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. She could feel Dr. Peters' presence in the room with her, but it was no longer threatening. It was Sarah realized that Dr. Peters was not a malevolent spirit, but a lost and lonely soul who had been trapped in the hospital for decades. And so she made it her mission to help him find peace. Through a combination of research and intuition, Sarah was able to piece together the fragments of Dr. Peter's life and help him find closure. And in doing so, she was able to put the ghostly presence of the old doctor to rest. Story 3. The dark room. The hospital had been abandoned for years, but the memories of its former occupants lingered on in the empty hallways and sterile rooms. For years, the dark room had been a source of fear and mystery for anyone who set foot in the hospital. It was said that the room had been used for experimental treatments that had gone horribly wrong. The details were sketchy, but the rumors spoke of patients who had been locked away in the room for weeks at a time, subjected to torturous experiments that left them broken and scarred. But no one knew for sure what had happened in the dark room, and so it remained sealed off and untouched for years. Until one day, a group of teenagers broke into the hospital, intent on exploring its dark and twisted secrets. They found the dark room easily enough, but what they found inside was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The room was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of decay and rot. And as the teenagers shone their flashlights into the darkness, they saw something that would haunt them forever. The walls of the room were covered in strange markings and symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light of their flashlights. And in the center of the room, a lone figure sat huddled on the floor. It was a woman, her eyes wild and crazed, her hair matted and tangled. She was naked, covered in scars and bruises, and she rocked back and forth on the floor, muttering incoherently. The teenagers froze, unsure of what to do. But then the woman looked up, and her eyes locked onto theirs. They could feel the weight of her gaze bearing down on them, and they knew that they had to get out of there, fast. They turned and ran, but the woman pursued them relentlessly, her screams echoing through the empty hallways of the hospital. They could hear her laughter and gibbering, even after they had left the building far behind. And in the days that followed, the teenagers began to experience strange and unsettling phenomena. They would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling as though someone was watching them. They would hear strange noises in their homes, scratching at the windows, whispering in the darkness. It was as though the spirit of the woman from the dark room had followed them home, and was determined to torment them until they could take it no longer. In the end, the teenagers were forced to seek out the help of a paranormal investigator, who was able to cleanse their homes of the dark energy that had taken root there. But the memory of the dark room and the tortured spirit that lurked within it would haunt them for the rest of their lives.